part, we're going to kind of put together what we've been talking about with regard to each hemisphere having three cells, the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell. So just to kind of, if we call this the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, that wanders north in the summer for us and south in the winter for us. We have the Hadley cell, the Ferrel cell, and the polar cell. Hadley cell, Ferrel cell, and polar cell in the southern hemisphere. And then we said that we kind of have these semi-permanent high pressures here and semi-permanent low pressures here. And kind of related to that, we would think that where we have these high pressures, that descending air will tend to be kind of dry. And up here where we have these low pressures here, that air will be converging there, and we would tend to kind of see precipitation. Precip, dry, and actually here at the Intertropical Convergence Zone where we have that warm moist air lifting, we would expect to see precipitation. So, you know, we can kind of come up with just a general looking for these bands of precipitation, but it's just not that easy, is it? Because actually there are other influences as to whether a region is going to generally have precipitation, not on a day-to-day basis, but kind of on an ongoing basis. So for instance, cold air, we said that the amounts when it's saturated are generally lower amounts, so when it does precipitate, there's not going to be as much potential precipitation. So as you get to colder latitudes, it's going to be drier versus warmer latitudes has the potential for more moisture. And the other thing is if it's inland or continental versus marine, that's going to change your precipitation. So it's just not all so easy. Then the other factor, or another factor for do you generally get precipitation in a particular region, is the presence of mountains. And if you're on the windward side of the mountain, you might get a lot of precipitation. On the leeward side or the downwind side, it might be pretty dry. And then another thing is just in general, what sort of prevailing wind do you have for that location? Now, when we're talking about prevailing surface winds, hopefully you're thinking things like the easterly trades, east trades, that would be a prevailing wind. The mid-latitude westerlies, mid-westerlies, and of course, associated with the polar cell, we have the polar easterlies. Those are prevailing winds, and those will definitely make a difference as to whether you are going to have precipitation. Proximity to water, that would be continental versus a maritime location. So this is looking at on an annual basis. If we try to look for some of those trends, remember we have the cells can be broken up into, if we assume that the intertropical, and you know what they say about assumptions, but if we assume the intertropical convergence zone is about around the equator, the Hadley cell will stop about 30 degrees, and then from 30 to 60 we have the Ferrel cell, and then from 60 to 90 we have the polar cell. So we said we tend to have subtropical highs here about 30. And actually, as far as where are our deserts, not bad. Yeah, I see a fair bit of desert there. Okay, but I also see dry conditions up here. And again, when we get up to our upper latitudes, our colder air is, when it does, it's going to have less of a capacity for moisture. Looking at our intertropical convergence zone, you would expect that rising air would be giving us plenty of precip, and there is plenty of precip. Again, you know, though, the prevailing winds and the maritime versus continental location, that's definitely still a player. So that was annual, and this is 6 months apart. One of the things I thought was kind of noted is if the blue represents a lot of precip, and you figure at the intertropical convergence zone we have a fair bit of precipitation. Can you see where in July we talked about the intertropical convergence zone would kind of wander north? Okay, and in January, the intertropical convergence zone kind of wanders south. I thought that was kind of interesting, and you might kind of see it in precipitation. So we'll talk more about climates at the end of the course, but if we were just to kind of focus on our cells, so we have 2 Hadley cells, 2 Ferrel cells, and 2 polar cells, and kind of look at them edge on, we would tend to think that we would generally, our climates here associated with the kind of the intertropical convergence zone and halfway in the Hadley cell, we would expect a lot of precipitation. This is just idealized. And then on either side of that, we would expect, still within the Hadley cell, before we get to that descending air, creating that semi-permanent high, we would expect to have dry winters and wet summers. Okay, then where the Hadley and the Ferrel cell meets, dry in all seasons. Then we kind of move to the Ferrel cell. We would tend to expect wet winters, dry summers. The middle of the Ferrel cell onto, basically, into the polar cell beyond the polar front. Okay, you can see. And so do you see where, you know, in an idealized sort of setting, we kind of have these matching kind of climates on either side of the intertropical convergence zone. But we'll shall see there's a little variation to that.